While I was completely immersed in my work, the phone rang, interrupting my focus. It was Isabella. At that moment, I hardly had time for conversations and wanted to end the call before she finished, especially when I noticed her hesitation before speaking. But before I could say I was busy, she began to sob. Suddenly, everything else faded in the face of my daughter's evident pain. "What's wrong, honey? Isabella, tell me," I pleaded, feeling helpless hearing the distress in her sobs. "Has someone died?" I questioned myself, or perhaps it was a breakup with her boyfriend. What if she was pregnant? A multitude of possibilities for the pain whirled in my mind like clothes in the dryer. "Oh, Daddy," Isabella sobbed, "we need to talk to you." "Is she pregnant?" I started to speak, ready to head home immediately. "No, Dad," insisted my daughter, "we need to meet away from Mom." That surprised me, as it was usually my wife who maintained a close relationship with our children. When we agreed to meet at the park lake after work, she said, "We love you, Daddy," sadly, before hanging up. The rest of the day was futile at work. I could only think about Isabella. "We love you, Daddy." Her voice sounded so sad. Why did her words hurt me so much? Who was this we? Her and her siblings? Her and a love interest? I couldn't focus on work. Joanna and I met when I was on leave in San Diego in 2005. She worked as a topless waitress while attending college. I was an excited sailor, lucky enough to get involved with a woman who was a goddess, too good for the bar she worked at, where she faced harassment. Long story short, I spent my entire leave with Joanna and, after a brief cruise, returned to San Diego with the firm intention of having her forever. We eloped to Vegas, got married, were gearing up for a wonderful honeymoon when my ship was summoned to the Persian Gulf. I took Joanna to my small hometown, where my parents had a rented house they offered to us. I tried to introduce her to some friends before returning to service, but she didn't seem to connect with them. They were too straightforward for Joanna, used to a more interesting crowd in San Diego. I felt uneasy leaving her in a strange place with no friends besides my parents, but the first letter reassured me. She had met a woman named Sophia, whom she seemed to connect with instantly. Joanna was just that kind of person. Look how quickly we connect. The letter spoke of how much she missed me but was busy with Sophia, her boyfriend Bucky, and friends. She seemed happy, but I still felt guilty for not being there for her. Then, during my second month in the Gulf, I received the joyful news: Joanna was pregnant. Apparently, our farewell had an effect. Now, Joanna wouldn't be alone. I was lucky. Shortly after Isabella's birth, I was sent back to the States to train on the updated radar system. Joanna and Isabella could join me at school occasionally. I loved my daughter from the moment I saw her and, of course, loved my wife, often before returning to my ship. Deja vu, during my second month in the Gulf, I received the joyful news again that Joanna was pregnant. Diana was a stubborn child, waiting until the 42nd week to be born. We feared a possible stillbirth, but she seemed strong and resilient. I was stuck in the Gulf of Mexico when Diana finally arrived. When I returned to the States, I spent a week at home before heading back to San Diego to go through the discharge process. Upon returning home, I was able to accompany my pregnant wife to her first yoga class. Ian came into our lives arriving in the 38th week. Joanna was busy with the kids and spent a lot of time with my retired parents. I asked my mom what had happened to Sophia and her friends. "I haven't seen much of them in the last few months," my mom told me. "You know, having kids makes it hard to keep up with your single friends. I think Joanna is just settling down. She doesn't have many new friends. Everyone she knows now has kids. Joanna, the kids, and I led an idyllic life in my hometown. I managed to leverage my Navy education to land a position as an engineer at the local television station. It was a well-paying job, and over the next 12 years, I managed to advance to department head. We had a wonderful lifestyle with healthy and active children. What could have gone wrong? What went wrong? I pondered, waiting at the lake. I arrived early and was very nervous. Waiting didn't improve my mood, nor did the tight hugs the three children gave me. They all had tears in their eyes and seemed to avoid looking into mine. A meeting in the park led me to a bench. I sat between my daughters, and my son stood beside us. Diana squeezed one of my hands and rested her head on my shoulder, crying, saying, "Daddy." Isabella composed herself and began, "We love you, you are our daddy forever." She couldn't hold back and cried again. My God, what was this? I started to feel short of breath too. She continued, Daddy, my class got an assignment to create a family tree, and I thought I could get more information by sending our DNA to 23andMe. She wiped her eyes. Cousin Elizabeth told me about her family's results, and I thought it would be a big surprise for you and Mom, so I submitted Diana and Ian's data. I was struggling to breathe. All I could think of was where this might lead, and I didn't want to hear my daughter say it. Daddy, we are not your children. Isabella looked at me with the saddest expression I had ever seen. I shook my head. Wait a minute, you didn't have my DNA, so what makes you think you're not my daughter? I almost laughed in relief. Whatever the kids think, it must be a mistake. Daughter, they show that you're related to everyone on Mom's maternal side, but the paternal side has people we don't know. Mostly European. That sent shivers down my spine. I tried to understand how the kids could have gotten Joanna's correct DNA version but not mine. Is it like this for all three? I asked, confused. Yes, we're full siblings, Diane said, squeezing my hand. You're our daddy, she nestled into my chest. Ian looked miserable, as if he wanted to cry but was trying to be strong. He sniffed and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. We sat in silence for a few minutes. I could hear my daughters crying softly and my son shuffling his shoe against the ground. Finally, I spoke, give me the 23andMe reports. You can go to the movies or do something tonight, maybe go out. Let me talk to your mom. I hugged the girls and pulled them close to me. Ian squeezed my hand, trying to be a man despite the tears. They agreed to spend the night at a friend's house. Isabella handed me the reports, and they left. But before they left, all three turned to look at me. I am your father, no matter what happens, no matter what these reports say. There's no one else. I forced a smile. You are my children, and I couldn't wish for better. I kissed them again and hugged them tightly. I was left alone, staring at the reports. There could be no mistake, they were clearly Joanna's children, not mine. I didn't know anyone on my father's family side. All my relatives were missing, including my sister and her family. I drove home to uncover the truth. Joanna was preparing dinner, but she turned around when I entered, opening her arms to hug and kiss me as she always did. She stopped when she saw my face. What happened? You never spoke to me so coldly, she said. Who is their father, Joanna? I advanced, growling. Her face went pale, and her eyes widened in panic. What? What are you talking about? Isabella did a DNA test for all three, I said, advancing further. Who is their father? Joanna staggered to a chair and sat down. Ian was supposed to be yours, she mumbled, looking at the floor and shaking her head. But Ian is the right father for the two girls, a brother who you... Are you still? I was losing control, clenching my fists not to hit her. It's not possible, Jim, it's impossible, Joanna shook her head. She began to get up, but I grabbed her and pushed her back into the chair. She shuddered and looked at me with fear in her eyes. You sit down now and tell me what happened, or I'll have to pry it out of you. My threat escalated her fear. I was in so much pain and anger that I might have hurt her for a moment. She stared at me for a moment and lowered her head, defeated. It began so quietly I could barely hear, it was so long ago. Suddenly, I found myself in this small town alone. I loved you, but you had gone. Your friends were so boring, but then I met Sophia, and she took me to the local bars. She had drugs, like the club in San Diego. I was 19, used to partying. I loved you, but you left me here. Sophia and Bucky were fun, we partied, got drunk. You weren't even 2 weeks old when I woke up in bed with Bucky, he had other friends there too. I don't know who the father was, but probably one of them, she looked at me desperately. I prayed it was you, I really did. It could have been, we had so much sex before you left, she lowered her gaze, admitting defeat. I was stunned. You weren't faithful for even 2 weeks, and with so many guys that you don't know who could be the baby's father, I stood and pounded the table with my fists. You're joking. Your head was spinning, but you know, I love sex, you were all I needed, that's why I married you, I didn't need anyone else, she looked at me sadly, but you weren't here, and maybe Sophia's blackmail was the excuse I needed. So, I thought if I had to have sex, it might as well be enjoyable. She saw the expression on my face. I know you're suffering, but I want to be honest. Yes, I was drugged, raped, and blackmailed, but I got over it. She started sobbing again. You weren't here, and I needed it. I went to clubs with Sophia, and she encouraged me to go to the parking lot with her friends. We had sex in Sophia's car back seat, or in Bucky's van, or some guy's car if Sophia was in hers. And there were orgies, usually on Saturdays. Whenever you came back home, I refused to go to Sophia and Bucky's gatherings. I didn't go to the club with Sophia. You were all I needed. She looked at me with fear and tears in her eyes. I made sure you didn't even know Sophia and Bucky. You didn't even realize. You were always either with the girls or in bed with me. Speaking of the girls, where were Isabella and Diane while you were having fun? I was mocking that woman who was the mother of my children. Your mother liked taking care of them. She knew I was lonely here. I never lived in a small town like you. I'm used to parties and thrills in San Diego. I was used to sailors groping and desiring me. She lowered her head and sobbed. Damn it, I was used to being possessed. I was shocked. Now my wife was looking at me as if it were my fault. I wanted to retaliate. So are you still whoring around with Sophia or found a new pimp? Joanna smiled crookedly. Good choice of words. I used to think I was just having fun at parties, but one night, just before you returned from the Gulf for good, Sophia got sick, and I went to the club alone, since I had already left the kids with your mother. She shook her head and wrinkled her nose. I wasn't forced to go to the club, but by then I was attending and having sex on my own. One of the regulars from the orgies was there, and I went with him to the car after he finished. When I was getting dressed, he handed me some money. I asked what it was for, and he said since neither Sophia nor Bucky were there, he thought he should give it to me. Usually, it's them who take the money. That's when I realized I wasn't just what I thought I was a prostitute. Tears streamed down my face again. I thought I had low self-esteem, but that night I found out it was even worse than I imagined. She looked into my eyes for a few moments before continuing. That's when I told Sophia and Bucky to go to hell. I threatened to go to the police, even if it meant being arrested for prostitution. You should have been home within a month. I just wanted to spend my life with you. Her face contorted. I just wanted you. A month. That doesn't explain, Ian. I can't explain with Ian. Bucky insisted on having more sex, but I used spermicide and made him use a condom. I was sure Ian was yours. I sat for a few minutes. We looked at each other in silence. I pondered on the years we had spent together, wondering if it was just us or if there were others in bed with us, so to speak. Then I thought, 2 weeks, just 2 weeks alone, and she was already sleeping with Bucky. That's when I realized I would never trust her again. Pack your things, say goodbye to the kids, and disappear from my life. I could have forgiven you if you had told me when you first woke up with Bucky, but how can I trust someone who admits to liking prostitution for years, even when it wasn't necessary? You couldn't wait to open your legs, but since that last time with Bucky, it's just been you. I've always been faithful. She saw the look in my eyes. We'll never get past this, she sobbed, got up, and left the room to pack. I left home. Later, I found out that she had packed most of her clothes and left. I don't know where she went, but she came back home the next day when I was at work. She wanted to try to explain everything to the kids. They weren't kind to her, especially Isabella, who was extremely cruel. My neighbor later told me that Isabella kicked her out, calling her names. Isabella shouted for her to go prostitute herself somewhere else as the neighbors came out to see what was happening, and Diane and Ian watched from the balcony. We never saw Joanna again. She went to the bank and withdrew most of our savings. She left me with investment accounts, so I ended up with more than half of our fortune, not counting the house. I didn't know where to file her divorce papers, so I just waited the 2 necessary years to report a missing person. My mother loved Joanna as if she were her own daughter, even more than my kids. I was afraid to tell her about Joanna's prostitution, and the eyes show that yes, apparently, they are related to a lot of Swedes. Most of their relatives are in Sweden. My mother looked up attentively. How does it match with your DNA? I explained that we had never taken a DNA test, but it wasn't necessary. My kids should have the same DNA as my sister and her offspring. My mother shook her head in disbelief. I never thought that mattered, so we never told you. I really didn't think it mattered. You're my son. I didn't understand what my mother was saying. I was her son, wasn't I? My father's son. My kids should be like my sisters. Mom, what are you talking about? She looked at me almost pityingly. Son, you were adopted. We had a Swedish au pair for your sister who got pregnant. We wanted a child, so we adopted you. Your biological mother went back to Sweden after you were born. You were our child, so we never told you about it. Well, I took a DNA test, and it matched my 3 kids. They were mine, as I said. We never saw Joanna again. I don't know what happened to her and could never tell her I was the father of her children. But did it matter? If the children's DNA hadn't matched my relatives, I would never have known about my wife's promiscuous past and probably would have remained happily married. But now, would I be able to forget her past, even if the children were mine? No, it all boils down to the fact that 2 years was the limit of her marital fidelity, and even though she might have been coerced initially, she admitted to accepting the life Sophia and Bucky provided for her. That's what I tell my kids now. Who would have imagined that marrying a scantily clad waitress from a rundown bar in San Diego would end up like this?